Queen Elizabeth I wasn't just a queen. She was a legend, part ruler, part myth, and part living performance. People called her the Virgin Queen, the untouchable monarch who never aged, never faltered, and never allowed the world to see weakness. Wrapped in pearls, velvet, and jewels, she seemed flawless. But behind the mask of power was something far less glamorous. Her body was falling apart, and her hygiene by today's standards was absolutely disgusting. Imagine the most powerful woman in Europe, feared by kings, worshipped by her people, yet hiding rotting teeth, toxic makeup, and palaces that smelled like open sewers. Elizabeth I built her image like armor. Every gown, every painted portrait, every ritual of cleanliness wasn't about health. It was about control. She didn't want to be seen as human. She wanted to be eternal. But keeping up that illusion came at a shocking price. She didn't wash like we do. She didn't brush her teeth like we do. She didn't even think about hygiene as health. To her, it was all theater. Perfumes instead of baths, powders instead of soap. Makeup so poisonous it scarred her skin and shook her memory. The Queen of England was slowly killing herself, one ritual at a time, all to keep her image untouchable. And here's the wild part. Her courtiers copied her every move. If Elizabeth I had blackened, decayed teeth, then noble ladies painted their own teeth black to match. If the queen avoided bathing for fear of disease, her court followed along. Her influence was so powerful that filth itself became fashionable. Imagine living in a world where even rotting breath could be a symbol of status. But make no mistake, this wasn't just strange. It was calculated. Elizabeth I understood the brutal politics of her time. She saw her mother, Anne Boleyn, destroyed by whispers and rumors. She knew that one crack in her image could shatter the entire crown. So she turned her body into a fortress of perfume, powder, and illusion. She mastered the art of being seen without ever being truly known. And that's what makes her story so disturbing. Because the further you look past the pearls and portraits, the more grotesque it gets. From sugar rotting her mouth to wigs crawling with lice. From perfumes meant to mask stench to golden palaces hiding mountains of filth. Elizabeth I's hygiene wasn't just unusual. It was a secret war against reality itself. In this video, we're breaking down the 10 most disgusting hygiene practices of Queen Elizabeth I, each one stranger, darker, and more shocking than the last. And when we get to number 1, you'll see the truth she tried to bury for decades. A truth so disturbing, it will make you question everything you thought you knew about royalty. Number 10. Sugar-coated smile. Elizabeth Thorne had a sweet tooth. But not just any sweet tooth, the kind that turned into an obsession. In the late 1500s, sugar wasn't something everyone could get. It was a rare luxury, imported from far-off lands at enormous cost. Most people in England might never taste sugar in their entire lifetime. But Elizabeth, as queen, had endless access, and she didn't just enjoy it. She drowned in it. Her royal feasts included candied violets, sugar-dusted fruits, marzipan shaped like castles, and desserts dripping in syrup. Sugar wasn't just food, it was a performance of power. To serve it was to show off England's growing reach across the world. The queen loved sweets so much that she built her daily diet around them. But this indulgence carried a horrifying side effect. Back then, dental care was primitive. There were no modern toothbrushes, no dentists with drills, no mouthwash. People used rough cloths, twigs, even ground-up eggshells to scrub their teeth. Elizabeth had her own recipe for toothpaste, but here's the shocking twist. It included sugar. That's right. The very ingredient destroying her teeth was the same thing she used to clean them. At first, it seemed harmless, but over the years, the damage piled up. By the 1590s, foreign visitors to her court reported that Elizabeth's teeth were blackened, broken, or missing entirely. Her once royal smile had become a horror, and it wasn't just how it looked. Her breath was so foul that standing close to her was said to be unbearable. Even worse, her speech sometimes slurred because she was trying to talk through a mouth of rot. Now, you'd think a queen would have the rotten teeth pulled out, but Elizabeth I was famously stubborn and terrified of pain. She refused dental extractions. The story goes that one of her loyal courtiers even had a tooth pulled in front of her, screaming in agony, just to prove it wasn't deadly. That was the level of fear she lived with. She'd rather keep a decaying smile than face the surgeon's pliers. But perhaps the most bizarre part of this story isn't her mouth. It's what her courtiers did in response. Instead of mocking her, they copied her. Ladies of the court began blackening their own teeth with soot and charcoal to match the queen's smile. That's how powerful her influence was. In Elizabeth's England, black teeth didn't mean decay. They meant wealth, beauty, and royal connection. The darker your smile, the higher your status. Think about that for a second. The smell, the rot, the discomfort, it didn't matter. If the queen had black teeth, then black teeth became fashionable. In a world where appearances defined survival at court, even tooth decay turned into a badge of glory. This wasn't just fashion, it was submission. It was a way of saying, if the queen suffers this, so will we. And so, what began as Elizabeth's private addiction became a court-wide phenomenon. Her smile was no longer just about her. It became a symbol of England itself, powerful on the outside, but rotting beneath the surface. And the more her body broke down, the more her courtiers turned that decay into trend. Elizabeth's sugar obsession reminds us of one thing: power can make even the most disgusting things desirable. In her court, sweetness came with rot, and rot came with fashion. The queen's smile wasn't just ruined, it was weaponized, and that was only the beginning of her bizarre hygiene rituals. Number 9. The once-a-month bath. You may have heard the famous line often attributed to Elizabeth I, "I bathe once a month whether I need it or not." Historians still argue whether she ever truly said it, but whether it was a real quote or just a legend, one thing is certain: her bathing habits were shockingly rare by today's standards. To understand why, you need to step back into the 1500s. At the time, people didn't see water as something that cleaned the body. They saw it as dangerous. Doctors warned that bathing opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to bad air, what they called miasma. This invisible poison was blamed for everything from coughs to the plague. Water wasn't health. Water was a risk. So, Elizabeth avoided it. Instead of bathing with soap and water, she had a very different ritual. She relied on linen underclothes called shifts. The belief was simple: fabric could absorb sweat, dirt, and toxins. By changing shifts several times a day, she thought she was pulling the filth out of her body without ever touching water. Imagine that. Your entire hygiene routine depending on how many fresh shirts you had. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. When she wanted to freshen up, she didn't wash, she dabbed. Her handmaids gently wiped her skin with cloth soaked in rosewater, vinegar, or herbal infusions made by her apothecaries. Lavender, thyme, mint, all brewed not to kill germs, but to give the illusion of purity. To her, the body wasn't something to scrub. It was something to preserve, like a sacred relic. Now, you might ask, why not just take a proper bath every now and then? Because bathing wasn't just risky, it was a massive ordeal. Her palaces had no plumbing, no pipes, no running water. To prepare a bath, servants had to drag out a giant wooden tub, heat dozens of buckets of water over fire, and haul them into her chamber. It required planning, effort, and several attendants just to make it possible. Taking a bath wasn't routine, it was an event, and Elizabeth, the master of appearances, turned even that into performance. If she bathed at all, it was surrounded by ritual and control, not daily habit. In fact, people in her time thought she was unusually clean for even attempting a bath once a month. But by our standards, her hygiene was almost non-existent. Still, she didn't look dirty. Far from it. Elizabeth was known for her flawless gowns, her perfumed gloves, her layers of velvet and silk. She carried scented handkerchiefs. She filled her rooms with the smells of roses and spices. To anyone standing near her, she seemed fresh and radiant. But it was an illusion. What she wore, what she dabbed on her skin, none of it actually removed filth, it only masked it. And that's the disturbing truth about her monthly bath. It wasn't about laziness, it was about control. Water could smudge her carefully painted face, it could weaken her fragile mask of power. It could make her human, and Elizabeth I could not allow herself to be seen as human. so she stayed wrapped in perfumes and fabric, convinced that cleanliness was a matter of appearance, not health. She didn't need to wash her body, she only needed to convince the world that her body was untouchable. And, in a way, she succeeded. The Virgin Queen remained spotless in the eyes of her court, even as reality told a much darker story. Number 8. Perfumed gloves and illusion of cleanliness. If Elizabeth I feared water, she needed another way to appear clean. Her solution? Perfume. And not just a dab behind the ears. Her entire court became an empire of scent. For Elizabeth, perfume wasn't luxury. It was survival. It was how she hid the truth of a body rarely washed and a palace filled with foul odors. The most famous symbol of this obsession was her gloves. Not ordinary gloves, but masterpieces soaked in oils, infused with herbs, stitched with embroidery, and scented with rare perfumes. When she raised her hand to wave, when she offered it for a kiss, her presence carried the sweet aroma of roses, cloves, ambergris, or even exotic spices brought back from voyages overseas. These gloves became her signature gift. Ambassadors, courtiers, and favorites all longed for a pair, because they weren't just fashion, they carried the scent of the queen herself. To wear them was to carry her aura, to smell them was to breathe in her presence. A perfumed glove wasn't just cloth, it was a royal relic. But behind the elegance was something darker. Perfume in Elizabeth's court wasn't about hygiene. It was about deception. The gloves didn't cleanse her hands. They didn't erase the sweat and grime of unwashed skin. They simply covered it, layering sweet smells over bitter reality. Elizabeth wasn't clean, she smelled clean. And for her, that was enough. She extended this trick beyond gloves. Handkerchiefs were drenched in perfumes so strong they could drown out the stench of illness and waste in her palaces. Rooms were filled with pomanders, spheres of herbs and resins carried or hung from belts. Even her wigs and gowns were dusted with scented powders. Wherever Elizabeth went, she turned the air itself into a weapon. She didn't have to bathe if the very atmosphere bent to her will, and people noticed. Visitors wrote about how the queen's presence seemed to carry freshness like a walking garden. It was deliberate theater. While sewage seeped under palace walls and rushes on the floor trapped filth and vermin, Elizabeth floated above it all, wrapped in layers of perfume. Her cleanliness was never skin deep, it was air deep. Yet this obsession had a cost. Perfumed gloves required constant renewal. The oil stained fabrics and irritated skin. Strong scents clung to her body, sometimes overwhelming. And the irony? People of her time also believed that powerful perfumes could block disease by overpowering the bad air. To Elizabeth, drowning in scent wasn't just fashion, it was medicine. The result was striking. A queen who lived in a world of illusion. She didn't wash the dirt away, she disguised it. She didn't fight the rot, she scented it. And the court around her followed, perfuming themselves to match her example, creating a kingdom that smelled far better than it ever looked. But this illusion couldn't last forever. Beneath the gloves, beneath the lace, beneath the endless layers of perfume, Elizabeth's body was still decaying. And, in her desperate attempt to cover it, she turned to something even more dangerous, makeup that poisoned her skin and mind. Number 7. Makeup mask of death. If perfume covered Elizabeth I's scent, makeup covered her skin. But this wasn't the kind of makeup we know today. This was poison in a jar. It didn't just damage her body, it slowly killed her. The queen's favorite cosmetic was something called Venetian cerris, a thick white paste made of vinegar and, here's the deadly part, white lead. She used it to paint her face into a mask of flawless pale skin, the beauty ideal of the 1500s. To Elizabeth, pale meant pure. It meant untouchable. It meant above the common world of sweat, sun, and labor. At first, the ceruse did exactly what she wanted. It covered freckles, scars, and signs of aging. It gave her a ghostly glow that painters could immortalize in portraits. But beneath that porcelain mask, the damage began. The leads seeped into her skin, poisoning her blood, corroding her face. It didn't smooth her skin, it destroyed it. The irony was cruel. The longer she wore the ceruse, the worse her skin became. It cracked, it blistered, it scarred. And the only way to hide the scars was to apply more cerus, layer upon layer, year after year, until Elizabeth's face was no longer skin but plaster. She wasn't wearing makeup. She was entombing herself in it. And that wasn't the only toxin she relied on. For her lips, she used vermilion, a deep red pigment made with mercury. It gave her that iconic blood-red smile, but it came with a terrible cost. Mercury attacks the nervous system. It causes tremors, memory loss, mood swings. Imagine the Queen, one of the sharpest minds in Europe, slowly losing her stability because of her lipstick. Some historians believe her sharp temper in later years, her constant paranoia, and her declining health were worsened by the very cosmetics she used every day. Makeup wasn't just dangerous, it was a slow executioner, and yet she refused to give it up. To her, the mask was worth more than the woman beneath it. There are chilling rumors about how far this illusion went. Servants whispered that Elizabeth never allowed anyone to see her without her face painted, that she slept in light layers of makeup rising in the morning already masked, that even in her most private moments the Queen's face didn't belong to her, it belonged to England. By the final decade of her life, Elizabeth's makeup had become armor. She was no longer the young queen who danced, laughed, and dazzled. She was the aging monarch terrified of decay, terrified of losing the image that held her court together. Behind the mask, her teeth were rotting, her skin was scarred, her hair was thinning. But no one was allowed to see that truth. Visitors described her face as radiant, but also terrifying. Like a wax figure come to life. Smooth from afar, cracked up close. A mask that could never be touched, because touching it might reveal the sickness underneath. She wasn't just hiding flaws, she was hiding mortality itself. And here's the cruelest detail. When Elizabeth died, the mask finally broke. Those who prepared her body saw the damage up close. The sores, the discoloration, the scars the makeup had concealed for decades. The face that ruled an empire was not the face anyone ever truly knew. Elizabeth's mask of death was more than cosmetics. It was her crown. It was the performance that kept England believing their queen was eternal, even as she slowly poisoned herself to maintain the lie. And as her skin cracked under the weight of lead and mercury, so too did the boundary between legend and reality. Number 6. Wigs, sugar water, and powdered hair. If Elizabeth I's face was a painted mask, her hair was the crown that completed the illusion. But just like her makeup, her hair wasn't what it seemed. What the world saw as thick, fiery locks of auburn glory were often little more than wigs, stiffened with strange mixtures and dusted with powder. Early in her reign, Elizabeth was admired for her natural hair, long, reddish gold, inherited from her father Henry VIII. But years of toxic cosmetics, poor hygiene, and relentless stress took their toll. By middle age, her once proud hair began to thin and fall out. Instead of showing weakness, she transformed this loss into another stage performance. The Queen turned to elaborate wigs, often bright auburn in color, to maintain her youthful, iconic image. But wigs in the 1500s weren't modern, light, or comfortable. They were heavy, itchy, and glued into place with sticky concoctions like resin, wax, and even, believe it or not, sugar water mixed with egg whites. These substances created a hardened shell, turning hair into something brittle and immovable. Imagine the Queen sitting for hours while her maids painted her scalp with sugar syrup, then pressing strands of hair or wig fibers into the sticky mess. When it dried, it was stiff as a board. And then came the powder. Not just a light dusting for style, but thick clouds of chalk, starch, and crushed minerals poured onto the head until her hair looked pale, flawless, and full. From a distance, it was impressive. Up close, it was suffocating. But here's where it turns disgusting. That same sugar water that held her wigs in place was also a magnet for insects. Lice, fleas, and even small worms could thrive in the sweet, sticky environment. Servants sometimes had to carefully scrape and comb out infestations from the Queen's hairpieces. The powder, meant to mask odor and dirt, mixed with sweat and oils, turning into a paste that clung to the scalp. The smell alone must have been unbearable. Yet Elizabeth wore her wigs proudly, each one carefully styled to reinforce her power. Some were curled and towering, others braided and jeweled. They weren't just fashion, they were armor. Every strand declared, "I am untouchable, I am eternal." But under that armor, her real hair was withering, her scalp scarred by years of lead-based makeup dripping down her face and seeping into her pores. By the later years of her reign, Elizabeth rarely revealed her real head, even in private. Her wigs became part of her royal identity. When she appeared in public, her blazing auburn crowns dazzled courtiers and terrified enemies, a reminder that the Virgin Queen was still radiant. But those closest to her whispered of bald patches, sores, and a head so fragile it had to be hidden at all costs. Think about the symbolism. Hair is often seen as life, youth, and vitality. For Elizabeth, losing it meant losing control. So she clung to her wigs, no matter how heavy, how itchy, how filthy. They weren't comfortable. They weren't clean, but they were essential. Her hairpieces, stiffened with sugar, powdered like plaster, and crawling with pests, became yet another mask. Another illusion in the performance of power. And just like her makeup, they carried a hidden truth. Beneath the crown of wigs was a queen slowly falling apart. Number 5. Waste and toilets. If Elizabeth I's wigs and makeup created the illusion of a perfect queen, her palaces told a very different story. Behind the velvet curtains, golden ceilings, and jeweled thrones, the reality of her hygiene was far from royal. In fact, it was downright disgusting. Because for all her wealth and power, Elizabeth lived in a world without plumbing. There were no flushing toilets, no running water, no sewage systems. Her private bathroom was nothing more than a wooden chair with a hidden chamber pot under the seat called a close stool. It looked elegant on the outside, upholstered and polished, but inside it was just a pot collecting royal waste. And here's the shocking twist. Emptying it wasn't the job of a lowly servant. It was the responsibility of a high-ranking courtier called the groom of the stool. This man wasn't just cleaning up after the queen, he was her most trusted attendant. Being that close to Elizabeth during her most private moments meant access to her secrets, her moods, even her political whispers. Imagine it, one of the most powerful positions at court, earned by literally handling the queen's waste. But the filth didn't stop there. The rest of the palace was even worse. Courtiers, servants, and guests all used chamber pots or buckets. These were emptied into cesspits under the floors, trenches outside the palace walls, or sometimes just thrown out of windows into the street. The stench was overwhelming. Visitors often wrote about how foul the air smelled, no matter how much perfume or herbs were burned to mask it. The people in charge of cleaning this nightmare were known as gong farmers or night soil men. They worked at night, crawling in the pits of human waste with shovels and buckets, hauling out tons of filth in the dark. Their work was dangerous, not only because of the diseases in the waste, but because the gases could suffocate them in minutes. These men were the invisible backbone of the palace, carrying away the waste of royalty by hand. And the smells? Unimaginable. People tried to cover it by laying down fresh rushes and straw on the palace floors, sprinkled with herbs like lavender, rosemary, and marjoram. But here's the disgusting part. Those rushes weren't replaced often. Layers of old straw, crumbs, dirt, hair, spilled food, and rot built up beneath the queen's feet, turning into a hidden carpet of filth crawling with insects and mold. Elizabeth herself wasn't immune to the stench. In fact, one reason she constantly moved her court from palace to palace wasn't just politics, it was hygiene. The longer she stayed in one place, the worse the waste problem became. Cesspits overflowed, air grew toxic, and no amount of rosewater or perfumed gloves could hide the reality. Her glittering court sat on top of a sewer. It's hard to imagine today, but this was daily life for the Queen of England. Her halls looked like heaven but smelled like hell. And yet, Elizabeth managed to turn even this to her advantage. She demanded that her personal toilet be perfumed with herbs and rose petals after every use. She ordered scented pomanders and oils to be carried through the halls. She wrapped filth in ceremony, making even the disgusting appear dignified. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Waste seeped through wooden floors. Rats thrived in cesspits. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid spread like wildfire. For all her jewels and power, Elizabeth I's world was never far from decay. Think about the irony. A queen who covered her face with poisonous lead to appear perfect, who perfumed her body to appear clean, who wore wigs to appear youthful, lived in palaces that reeked of human waste. The reality of royal hygiene was not golden, it was brown. This wasn't just about bad smells. It was a symbol of her reign itself, power and filth, beauty and rot, side by side, and Elizabeth knew it. By surrounding herself with perfumes, fresh linens, and illusions of cleanliness, she wasn't just hiding her own body, she was hiding the decay of her entire world. Number 4. Fear of water and bathing rituals. If you've ever heard the quote, "I bathe once a month whether I need it or not," you've heard one of the most infamous legends about Elizabeth I. Whether she actually said it or not, the truth behind the myth is just as strange and just as disgusting. Because to Elizabeth, water wasn't a source of cleanliness, it was a threat. In the 1500s, people believed that water could carry disease, open the pores, and let in poisonous air called miasma. To them, bathing wasn't healthy, it was dangerous. And Elizabeth, who had already lived through plague outbreaks and seen death sweep through cities, wasn't about to risk it. She may have been the most powerful woman in the world, but she lived in constant fear that water itself could kill her. So instead of scrubbing herself with soap and water, the queen created her own ritual of cleanliness. And like everything else in her life, it wasn't about hygiene, it was about performance. She wore fresh linen shifts, sometimes changing them multiple times a day. People believed the fabric pulled sweat and toxins out of the body, as if cloth could magically absorb filth. Each change of clothing was like a symbolic cleansing, a ritual of purity without ever touching water. When she did freshen up, it wasn't with baths. It was with rose water, vinegar rinses, and herbal concoctions dabbed onto her skin by handmaids. Drops of lavender oil behind the ears, vinegar brushed across the face, a wipe of rosemary water on the wrists. It wasn't about cleaning, it was about masking. Elizabeth's body became an altar, and her attendants were priests in a daily ceremony of illusion. Why not just take a real bath? Because a royal bath wasn't as simple as turning a faucet. It meant dragging out a massive wooden tub, hauling in dozens of buckets of heated water, and surrounding the queen with servants. Every bath was a production expensive, time-consuming, and, in her mind, risky. One wrong drop of bad water could bring sickness. One slip could reveal her aging, fragile skin, and so the queen avoided it. Instead, she surrounded herself with perfumes, oils, and flowers. She demanded scented gloves, perfumed handkerchiefs, and layers of finely embroidered gowns that gave the appearance of perfection. She didn't smell human, she smelled like a walking bouquet. But beneath the roses and lavender, the truth lingered. She was rarely, if ever, truly clean. There's something almost tragic about it. Elizabeth wasn't avoiding water because she was lazy. She was avoiding it because she was terrified. Terrified of aging, terrified of sickness, terrified of appearing human. Every skipped bath was an act of control, a way of saying, "I am not like you. I do not share your weaknesses." But the body doesn't obey illusions. Without proper washing, skin builds up layers of sweat, oils, and dirt. Perfume may cover the smell for a time, but eventually the truth seeps through. And yet Elizabeth clung to her rituals, clung to her fresh linens and rose water, as if they were shields against decay. To her, bathing wasn't just about health, it was about vulnerability. A naked, wet body was a body that could be touched, judged, even harmed. And Elizabeth, who had seen her mother executed and her throne constantly challenged, refused to show vulnerability to anyone, even water. So the Virgin Queen chose to stay robed, powdered, perfumed, and dry. In her world, to bathe was not to clean, it was to risk everything. Better to be wrapped in illusion than exposed to reality. Number 3. Perfume, pomanders, and the illusion of freshness. If Elizabeth I avoided water like poison, she embraced perfume like salvation. To her, scent wasn't just about smelling nice, it was about rewriting reality. She couldn't wash her body clean, but she could drown it in roses, lavender, and spice until the illusion of cleanliness felt stronger than the truth underneath. Every day, her maids prepared mixtures in the palace still rooms: rose water distilled from petals, lavender oil steeped in wine, vinegar infused with herbs like sage or rosemary. These weren't perfumes in glass bottles like we know today. They were potions, concoctions, dabbed onto her skin, poured into her gloves, and sprinkled over her gowns. A few drops behind the ears, a rub on the wrists, a perfumed handkerchief tucked in her sleeve, and Elizabeth could glide through court like a living bouquet. But perfume wasn't just decoration, it was armor. In a time when plague swept through cities, people believed strong scents could ward off disease. Smell, they thought, wasn't just a nuisance, it carried danger. Bad odors were linked to death, while sweet smells were seen as protection. So when Elizabeth perfumed herself, she wasn't only masking sweat. She was declaring herself untouchable, guarded by invisible walls of fragrance. Her most famous accessory was the pomander, a small ornate ball of gold or silver filled with herbs, resins, and spices. She carried them in her hands, wore them at her belt, or tucked them inside her gowns. When a foul odor crept too close, whether from a crowded hall, a sweating courtier, or the palace cesspits, she would lift the pomander to her nose and breathe in the world she had created for herself. A world of roses and cinnamon instead of filth and decay. This wasn't just about comfort. It was performance. When Elizabeth raised her perfumed handkerchief or scented walking stick, she was sending a message: I do not stink like you. I am above this world of flesh. Even her gloves were soaked in perfumes, to the point where gifting a pair of scented gloves from the Queen was seen as the highest honor. It wasn't just fabric, it was a piece of her divine illusion. But the reality was far less glamorous. Perfume didn't cleanse. It covered. Beneath the rosewater and herbs, sweat and oils still built up. The layers of fabric she wore trapped body heat, making her perspire even more. Perfume couldn't erase dirt, it only delayed the truth. And sometimes, the stronger the perfume, the more obvious it was that something foul was being hidden. Even her hairpieces weren't immune. Wigs were dusted with scented powders, sometimes mixed with orris root or cloves, not only to look stylish, but to disguise the odors of unwashed hair beneath. Over time, these powders mixed with oils and sweat, turning into a sticky, sweet-smelling paste crawling with lice. Yet still, Elizabeth doubled down, adding more perfume, more powder, more illusion. It's easy to laugh at it now. Imagine walking through a palace that smelled like a clashing storm of roses, vinegar, cloves, and sweat. But in Elizabeth's world, this was serious business. Scent was survival. Smelling fresh meant appearing in control. And for a queen whose entire reign depended on image, there was no room for the smell of weakness. In her final years, Elizabeth even carried a scented walking stick, lifting it to her face as she passed courtiers. It wasn't only to block odors. It was a gesture of separation, a reminder that she was not like them. She didn't share their filth, their disease, their mortality. Perfume had become her invisible crown. The air around her as carefully crafted as the jewels on her body. But in truth, perfume was a prison. The more she perfumed, the more she revealed what she was hiding. She wasn't a goddess untouched by decay. She was a woman fighting against it, bottle by bottle, drop by drop. Number 2. Rotting teeth and sugar addiction. If Elizabeth I was obsessed with perfume on the outside, her mouth told a darker story on the inside. Behind her famously commanding voice and her carefully crafted image was something she couldn't disguise forever: her teeth. By the later years of her reign, they were black, decayed, and crumbling from an addiction she couldn't resist: sugar. Sugar was the status symbol of the Tudor age. It was more valuable than spices, more prestigious than gold on the dining table. To serve sugar meant wealth. To eat sugar meant power. And Elizabeth adored it. Candied fruits, sugar-dusted almonds, marzipan sculptures shaped like castles and beasts. Her banquets were practically monuments to her sweet tooth. While the common people barely tasted sugar once a year, Elizabeth had it every single day. At first, it was luxury. But sugar was a slow poison. In an age with no toothpaste, no dentists, and barely any understanding of oral health, sugar clung to teeth like tar. The queen's gums inflamed, her enamel weakened, and over the years her mouth rotted from within. By her 40s, foreign ambassadors wrote home about her blackened teeth. By her 50s, her breath was said to carry a stench so foul that courtiers stood back when she spoke. This was more than embarrassing, it was dangerous. Elizabeth's voice was one of her greatest weapons. She was known for her fiery speeches, her ability to command men on the battlefield with words alone. But imagine delivering a rousing speech while your audience recoils from the smell. Image was power, and rotting teeth cracked the mask she built so carefully. Her courtiers, desperate not to outshine her, followed suit. Many began blackening their own teeth with soot to mimic the queen's look, turning decay into fashion. To have dark teeth meant you too could afford sugar. In this bizarre twist, Elizabeth's dental disaster became a trend across England, spreading rot as surely as her politics spread power. But the queen herself suffered. Letters suggest she endured pain when eating, sometimes unable to chew meat. Her meals had to be softened or cut into small pieces. Servants whispered of toothaches that kept her awake at night, forcing her to clutch cloths soaked in vinegar or cloves to numb the agony. Yet even as her mouth betrayed her, she refused to give up her beloved sugar. One infamous account describes Elizabeth being examined by a dentist from the Netherlands. The verdict? So many teeth were rotten that extraction would have left her unable to chew at all. The queen reportedly allowed only one tooth to be pulled, and it was such an ordeal that she swore never to endure the pain again. Imagine ruling an empire while your mouth throbbed day and night, a constant reminder that the very luxury you flaunted was slowly destroying you. Of course, Elizabeth wasn't alone. Many nobles of her court suffered similar fates, their smiles crumbling as sugar feasts became the hallmark of wealth. But the queen's case was symbolic. She embodied the contradiction of Tudor life, divine power on the surface, decay festering just beneath. Visitors from abroad noticed. The Venetian ambassador once noted her black and unsightly teeth, while the French envoys whispered of her foul breath. These were not the kinds of diplomatic impressions a monarch wanted to make, yet Elizabeth carried on, doubling down on perfumes, gloves, and pomanders to cover what no rosewater could disguise. And yet, perhaps in the most ironic twist, Elizabeth weaponized even this. She was known to laugh, to bare her teeth openly, unashamed. Some said it was defiance. Yes, my teeth are black, but I am still queen, and you will still kneel. It was the ultimate illusion of control turning weakness into another mask of power. Still, the reality was gruesome. By the end of her life, her mouth was a ruin. Pain, infection, and decay plagued her daily. She could perfume her gloves, powder her wigs, and drench herself in rosewater, but nothing could erase the rot gnawing from within. Sugar, the symbol of her wealth, had claimed its price. Elizabeth III will always be remembered for her glittering gowns, her fiery speeches, her iron will. But beneath the velvet and jewels, when she smiled, the truth could not be hidden. Her teeth were the perfect metaphor for her reign, dazzling on the surface, rotting underneath. Number 1. Deathbed stench and final days. For decades, Elizabeth I had lived inside a carefully constructed illusion. Perfumed gloves, powdered wigs, layers of makeup, and gallons of rosewater. All of it built a mask that told the world she was eternal, untouchable, almost divine. But when her body finally began to fail, that mask cracked. What emerged in her final days wasn't the Gloriana of legend, but a frail, stinking shadow of a queen. By the end of the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, an age most of her subjects never reached. She had outlived rivals, seen off the Spanish Armada, and transformed England into a rising power. But her body bore the scars of every compromise she made. The sugar had blackened her teeth. The lead makeup had damaged her skin. The perfumes had only hidden the filth beneath. And when she grew too weak to maintain the performance, everything came undone. Accounts from her ladies-in-waiting suggest she resisted being seen without her full regalia. She refused to go to bed, often standing for hours, propped against cushions, her finger bones clutching at her gowns. To remove her wig, to wash her face, to be stripped of her layers, that would be to admit defeat. So she resisted, even as her body gave way. The once sparkling image of the Virgin Queen turned into something pitiful, a skeleton in silks, her body unwashed, her breath unbearable. The stench became legendary. Those who entered her chambers during her final weeks described an odor so foul it clung to their clothes. Her skin, never properly cleansed, had grown sallow and cracked. Her teeth, long decayed, gave off the smell of infection. Even her wigs, powdered and perfumed, reeked when warmed by fever sweat. Perfumes could no longer hide the truth. For the first time, Elizabeth I's mask of roses collapsed into raw humanity, and it smelled of death. Doctors and courtiers hovered at her side, but medicine could do little. They tried poultices, herbal infusions, vinegar cloths, even prayers whispered by bishops, but none of it eased the decay. Some whispered of gangrene setting in. Others swore her gums oozed with infection. What they all agreed on was simple: being near her was unbearable. The very queen who had once dazzled Europe with her presence was now hidden behind veils, both to block the light and to conceal her wasting body. Her refusal to sleep in a bed made matters worse. For days, she stood or sat upright, refusing comfort, refusing rest. Her legs swelled, her body sagged, and her ladies had to beg her to lie down. But she resisted, perhaps out of fear that as she closed her eyes, she might never open them again. So she lingered in half-darkness, a walking corpse, the smell of sweat and infection seeping from every pore. The courtiers who once praised her beauty now recoiled. Sir Robert Carey, who witnessed her decline, described her as lame, old, and full of sores. Another noted how her once fiery hair was gone, her face pitted and pale, her lips sunken around her black teeth. She covered herself in jewels and gowns, but they only highlighted the ruin beneath. For a woman who had built her entire reign on image, this must have been torture. And yet, even here, Elizabeth clung to power. When asked to name her successor, she refused, either out of pride or suspicion. She would not give away the last piece of control she had. Instead, she lingered in silence, her body rotting, her presence unbearable, but her will unbroken. Those final days were not just a death. They were a siege. A queen fighting against time, losing inch by inch, smell by smell. On March 24, 1603, the battle ended. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the monarch who had reshaped England, finally collapsed into death. She was 69 years old. But even in death, the illusion cracked further. When her body was prepared, attendants reported how dreadful it was to handle. A mass of decay, brittle skin, and the stench of corruption. For all her perfumes, all her powders, all her fear of water, the truth could not be hidden. Her funeral was a spectacle of state, as grand as her reign had been. Thousands wept, dressed in black, the streets lined with mourners. But for those who had been in her chambers, who had smelled her in those last weeks, the memory was not of majesty. It was of a body undone by the very habits that once defined her. Elizabeth I's death was not only the end of a queen, it was the collapse of an illusion. She spent her life building an image untouchable by time, filth, or decay. But when the mask fell, she was revealed for what she truly was: human, vulnerable, mortal. And in those final days, no perfume, no glove, no crown could disguise the stench of death.